Marx and Primitive Accumulation, The Continuous Character of Capital's Enclosures, by Massimo De Angelis, from The Commoner No. 2, September 2001. 1. Introduction. In the last 20 years, the neoliberal orthodoxy became predominant in all major levels of government and shaped the policy recommendations of the major think tanks all around the world. Countries have witnessed continuous massive attacks on those functions of the state which are designed to compensate for the inadequacies and injustices of the market. Cuts in social spending have taken, of course, many forms and shapes. This depended on what was the historical and socioeconomic context in which they were implemented, either the rich countries of the north, the poor countries of the south, or the transnational countries of the east. Yet upon a cursory reading of the enormous literature of the subject, one is left with the strong sensation that there is something common between, say, the cut in unemployment benefits in Britain brought about by the need to balance the budget, the wave of privatization in Poland brought about by the need to dismantle state socialism, and the cuts in food subsidies in Tanzania brought about by the need to repay foreign debt. This paper suggests that a reinterpretation of Marx's theory of primitive accumulation may give us some important insights on the common social character of what prima facie appears to be different policies brought about by different circumstances. According to one main traditional interpretation, Marx's concept of primitive accumulation indicates a historical process that gave birth to the preconditions of a capitalist mode of production. These preconditions refer mainly to the creation of a section of the population with no other means of livelihood but their labor power to be sold in a nascent labor market, and to the accumulation of capital that may be used for nascent industries. In this conception, the adjective primitive corresponds to a clear-cut temporal dimension, the past, which becomes a condition for a capitalist future. Alternatively, the same concept of primitive accumulation has been interpreted as a continuous phenomenon within the capitalist mode of production, especially in connection to Marxist analysis describing the subordination of the South to the North of the world economy. In this paper, I argue that Marx's theory of primitive accumulation may be seen to contain both an historical and a continuity argument, but informs to depart from traditional interpretations. In the second section, I briefly review the two classical approaches to primitive accumulation within the Marxist tradition. In section 3, I discuss Marx's definition of primitive accumulation and locate it within his broader analysis of the capitalist mode of production. This will lead to my highlighting of two major theoretical implications of Marx's ideas of primitive accumulation. That is, the fact that it describes a forced separation between people and social means of production, and that this separation can take many forms. In section 4, I briefly expand on the latter and survey some of the forms of primitive accumulation discussed by Marx. Finally, in section 5, I return to the social meaning of primitive accumulation as identified in section 3. By drawing from Marx's theoretical apparatus, mainly his analysis of the relation between subject and object, his theory of alienation, and his distinction between accumulation and primitive accumulation, I argue that primitive accumulation is necessarily present in mature capitalist systems and, given the conflicting nature of capitalist relations, assumes a continuous character. In the conclusion, I briefly discuss the political implications of this analysis. To focus on Marx's theoretical discussion, I will abstract here from the debates around the role and meaning of socialist primitive accumulation. Also, for the same reason, I will not engage in the dissection of the meaning of the different nuances taken by the category studied, what in the literature is referred to as either original, primitive, or primary accumulation. My use of primitive accumulation in this paper is only a choice of convenience, as I believe this has been the most common use of the category, followed by original and then primary. Challenging this established custom should be the object of another paper. 2. A brief review of the traditional interpretations. The concept of primitive accumulation is one of those ideas that has entered the common vocabulary of Marxist scholars, without having generated much controversy or theoretical debate. Within the literature, it is possible to identify two main interpretive frameworks of primitive accumulation. The first one may be represented by Lenin's early study, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, 1899. This approach sees primitive accumulation mostly as a historical premise to the capitalist mode of production and therefore focuses on the process of separation between people and the means of production in the moment of transition between modes of production. In his polemic against the populists, who believe the absence of the developed market would prevent capitalist development in Russia, Lenin argued that the disappearance of the peasants and their expropriation along with that of their communities were the conditions for the creation of the capitalist market in Russia. Lenin saw this process as inevitable and ultimately positive, although he often underlined the contradictions of this process. However, these contradictions do not include patterns of peasant resistance against expropriation and how such resistance could have contributed to create outcomes contradicting the requirements of the development of Russian capitalism. As he did not foresee peasant resistance, he did not foresee a Russian's bloody legislation to meet that resistance. Rosa Luxemburg's The Accumulation of Capital, 1913, represents a second, different interpretation. Although she formally accepted the understanding of primitive accumulation as a one-time, one-place phenomenon leading to capitalism, her theoretical framework points towards a different interpretation. In Luxemburg's framework, Marx's expanded reproduction schemes are only a representation of the mathematical conditions for accumulation in the case in which there are only two classes. In reality, she contends, capitalist production must rely on third parties, peasants, small independent producers, etc., to be commodity buyers. Thus, the enforcement of exchange relations between capitalist and non-capitalist production becomes necessary to realize surplus value. However, this exchange relation clashes with the social relations of non-capitalist production. To overcome the resistance to capital that arises from this clash, capital must resort to military and political violence. Here, Luxemburg introduces a crucial thesis that, independently from the validity of her reasoning and interpretation of Marxist schemes, seems to me fundamental. The extra economic prerequisite to capitalist production, what we shall call primitive accumulation, is an inherent and continuous element of modern societies, and its range of action extends the entire world. Consequently, Luxemburg is able to combine her theoretical analysis of accumulation with a political conjuncture. Once the whole world becomes capitalist, capitalist accumulation will have reached its historical end. Here, class struggle enters the scene as a deus ex machina before the collapse is brought about by objective conditions. As in the case of Lenin, also for Luxemburg, resistance and struggle are not constitutive elements of primitive accumulation, but only a possible, albeit important, byproduct. Lenin's and Luxemburg's two classic interpretations have left a mark on subsequent approaches. It is perhaps useful to label Lenin's interpretation as historical primitive accumulation, to indicate an age, historically and temporally defined, describing the patterns of separation between people and means of production. Luxemburg's approach to primitive accumulation could be instead labeled as inherent continuous primitive accumulation, to indicate the fact that the characteristic extra-economic process of separation between people and means of production is a continuous and inherent process of capitalist production. Subsequent, more modern interpretations seem to share the basic characteristics of the two approaches. For example, in his classic studies on the development of capitalism, Maurice Daub uses the category primitive accumulation to indicate a well-defined age of accumulation of property rights, better known as the mercantile age. Quote, "If any sense is to be made, therefore, of the notion of primitive accumulation, in Marx's sense of the term, prior in time to the full flowering of capitalist production, this must be interpreted in the first place as an accumulation of capital claims, of titles to existing assets which are accumulated primarily for speculative reasons, and secondly, as accumulation in the hands of a class that, by virtue of its special position in society, is capable ultimately of transforming those hoarded titles to wealth into actual means of production. In other words, when one speaks of accumulation in a historical sense, one must be referring to the ownership of assets, and to a transfer of ownership, and not to the quantity of tangible instruments of production in existence." End quote. According to Daub, therefore, primitive accumulation is accumulation in an historical sense. It is worth noticing that also Paul Sweezy, Daub's main opponent, in the famous debate on the transition from feudalism to capitalism, published in Science and Society, 1950 to 1953, acknowledges Dobbs' quote, excellent treatment of the essential problems of the period of original accumulation, end quote. The now historic debate on transition and its later developments and transfigurations, such as the Brenner debate in the pages of the journal Past and Present of the 1970s, and later exchanges in Science and Society, is characterized by a general common acceptance of this historical definition of primitive accumulation. Different from Dobbs' approach of primitive accumulation as an historical prior period is the approach of Samir Amin, which is closer to the notion of inherent and continuous primitive accumulation that occurs through what Amin defines transfer of value within the world economy, quote, relations between the formations of the developed or advanced world, the center, and those of the underdeveloped world, the periphery, are affected by transfers of value, and these constitute the essence of the problem of accumulation on a world scale. Whenever the capitalist mode of production enters into relations with pre-capitalist modes of production and subjects these to itself, transfers of value take place from the pre-capitalist to the capitalist formations, as a result of the mechanisms of primitive accumulation. These mechanisms do not belong only to the prehistory of capitalism, they are contemporary as well. It is these forms of primitive accumulation, modified but persistent, to the advantage of the center, that form the domain of the theory of accumulation on a world scale. End quote. Another interpretation within this general framework may also include Wallerstein's notion of a world system. The continuous character of primitive accumulation in these accounts stresses objective mechanisms of accumulation and circulation of capital. A careful examination of Marx's definition of primitive accumulation allows us to critically appraise the historical and continuous arguments and reformulating them politically. The crucial idea at the core of Marx's approach is a concept of separation between producers and means of production. In what follows, I will mostly refer to this simply as separation. This concept, when inserted within the contrasting logic of boundless accumulation of capital and people's struggle for freedom and dignity, not only help us to understand the recurrent nature of primitive accumulation, but also points to the central political issue of any alternative to capitalism, that of direct access of means of existence. 3. Marx's concept of primitive accumulation. 3.1. The definition of primitive accumulation. In the 8 chapters of Part 8 of Volume 1 of Capital, Marx discusses the so-called primitive accumulation. For any given time period, the process of accumulation presupposes, of course, that some pre-accumulated capital was thrown into the process of production. It seems therefore that capitalist production as a whole presupposes some original or primitive accumulation. Although he never uses the term, Adam Smith was the first to refer to this notion by claiming that the accumulation of stock is a precondition for a division of labor, and consequently, for the improvement of the productive power of labor. Marx's approach to primitive accumulation appears from the start linked to the different theoretical meaning he gives to the category of capital. The notion of primitive accumulation is based on the notion of capital as class relation, rather than capital as stock. The capital relation presupposes a complete separation between the workers and the ownership of the conditions for the realization of their labor. Given the meaning of capital as class relation, it follows therefore that, quote, the process which creates a capitalist relation can be nothing other than the process which divorces the worker from the ownership of the condition of his own labor. It is a process which operates two transformations. Thereby the social means of subsistence and production are turned into capital, and the immediate producers are turned into wage laborers. Thus, the so-called primitive accumulation is nothing else than the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production. End quote from Marx. We can also find indication of Marx's emphasis on class relations in the structure of the section of Capital. Marx dedicates 2 chapters of this section on the formation of the working class, chapters 27 and 28, and 3 chapters on the formation of the bourgeoisie, chapters 29, 30, and 31. There are 3 central points that I believe are key in understanding Marx's approach to primitive accumulation. The first is that the separation of producers and means of production is a common character of both accumulation and primitive accumulation. The second is that this separation is a central category, if not the central category, of Marx's critique of political economy. The third is that the difference between accumulation and primitive accumulation, not being a substantive one, is a difference in the conditions and forms in which the separation is implemented. In what follows, I analyze these three aspects in sequence. 3.2. Separation and the secret of primitive accumulation. The idea of separation applies to both accumulation and primitive accumulation. Marx is extremely precise on this. In Volume 3 of Capital, he stresses that accumulation proper is nothing else than primitive accumulation, that Marx defined in Volume 1 in terms of the separation, raised to a higher power. In the Theories of Surplus Value, he is even more precise, writing that accumulation reproduces the separation and the independent existence of material wealth as against labor in an ever-increasing scale, and therefore merely presents as a continuous process what in primitive accumulation appears as a distinct historical process. Again, in the Gondries he states, once the separation is given, the production process can only produce it anew, reproduce it, and reproduce it on an expanded scale. 3.3. The meaning and centrality of separation in Marx's theory. It is known that Marx's own method of investigation starts from the laws of bourgeois economy as a key to the understanding of the past, rather than from the real history of the relations of production. Thus, understanding what Marx meant by separation in the context of capital's accumulation enables us to appreciate the meaning he gives to the original or primitive separation. In the context of accumulation, separation of producers and means of production means essentially that the objective conditions of living labor appear as separated, independent values opposite living labor capacity as subjective being, which therefore appears to them only as a value of another kind. The separation of producers and means of production at the social level means the positing of living labor and conditions of production as independent values, standing in opposition to each other. Quote, the objective conditions of living labor capacity are presupposed as having existence independent of it, as the objectivity of a subject distinct from living labor capacity and standing independently over against it. The reproduction and realization, i.e. the expansion of these objective conditions, is therefore at the same time their own reproduction and new production as the wealth of an alien subject indifferently and independently standing over against labor capacity. What is reproduced and produced anew is not only the presence of these objective conditions of living labor, but also their presence as independent values, i.e., values belonging to an alien subject, confronting this living labor capacity. End quote from Marx. This separation, therefore, is a fundamental condition for Marx's theory of reification, of the transformation of subject into object. In other words, because of this separation, the objective conditions of labor attain a subjective existence, vis-a-vis living labor capacity. This meant that the means of production are subjected to the drive towards self-valorization and self-expansion, and this, from the perspective of capital, is all that counts. On the other hand, living labor, the subjective being par excellence, is turned into a thing among things. It is merely a value of a particular use value alongside the conditions of its own realization as values of another use value. The specificity of this reification subject, living labor, is that, quote, the material on which it works is alien material. The instrument is likewise an alien instrument. Its labor appears as a mere accessory to their substance, and hence objectifies itself in things not belonging to it. Indeed, living labor itself appears as alien vis-a-vis living labor capacity, whose labor it is, whose own life's expression it is, for it has been surrendered to capital in exchange for objectified labor, for the product of labor itself. End quote. The idea of separation therefore strictly echoes Marx's analysis of alienated labor, as labor alienated from the object of production, the means of production, the product, and the other producers. The opposition that we have seen is implicit in this definition is, of course, a clashing opposition expressing a specific relationship of production, a specific social relationship in which the owners of the conditions of production treat living labor power as a thing. These same owners are regarded only as capital personified, in which capital is understood as having one sole driving force, the drive to valorize itself, to create surplus value, to make its constant part, the means of production, absorb the greatest possible amount of surplus labor. The concept of separation enables us to clarify Marx's reference to capital accumulation as an accumulation of social relations. The capitalist process of production, seen as a total connected process, i.e., a process of reproduction, produces not only commodities, not only surplus value, but it also produces and reproduces the capital relation itself. On the one hand, the capitalist, on the other hand, the wage laborer. 3.4. The distinction between accumulation and primitive accumulation. Having defined the common character of both accumulation and primitive accumulation, Marx is, of course, also eager to point out their distinctiveness. As opposed to accumulation proper, what may be called primitive accumulation is the historical basis, instead of the historical result, of specifically capitalist production. While sharing the same principle, separation, the two concepts point at two different conditions of existence. The former implies the ex novo production of the separation, while the latter implies the reproduction, on a greater scale, of the same separation. Quote, "It is in fact this divorce between the conditions of labor on the one hand and the producers on the other that forms the concept of capital, as this arises with primitive accumulation, subsequently appearing as a constant process in the accumulation and concentration of capital before it is finally expressed here as the centralization of capitals already existing in few hands and the decapitalization of many." End quote from Marx. The key difference thus resides for Marx not so much in the timing of the occurrence of the separation, although a sequential element is naturally always present, rather than the conditions and circumstances in which the separation is enforced. In the Grundrisse, for example, Marx stresses the distinction between the conditions of capital's arising, becoming, and the conditions of capital's existence, being. The former disappear as real capital arises, while the latter do not appear as conditions of its arising, but as a result of its presence. Marx is emphasizing here a simple but crucial point. Once developed historically, capital itself creates the conditions of existence, not as conditions for its arising, but as results of its being, and therefore it drives to reproduce, at an increasing scale, the separation between the means of production and producers. However, the ex novo production of the separation implies social forces that are posited outside the realm of impersonal, pure economic laws. The ex novo separation of means of production and producers corresponds to the ex novo creation of the opposition between the two, to the ex novo foundation of the specific alien character acquired by labor and capitalism. This is the element of novelty, of originality, that Marx seems to indicate when he stresses that, while accumulation relies primarily on the silent compulsion of economic relations, which sets the seal of the domination of the capitalist over the worker, in the case of primitive accumulation, the separation is imposed primarily through direct extra-economic force, such as the state, particular sections of social classes, etc. We can say, therefore, that primitive accumulation for Marx is a social process instigated by some social actor, the state, particular social classes, etc., aimed at the people who have some form of direct access to the means of production. This social process often takes the form of a strategy that aims to separate them from the means of production. The above discussion allows us to explicate two broad theoretical cornerstones towards a reformulation of Marx's theory of primitive accumulation. First, separation does not only indicate the rupture between modes of production in an epochal period of transition. This implies that primitive accumulation cannot be confined to a distant past. In Marx's interpretation, I am proposing there is nothing indicating that this separation may not occur at any time, even within a mature capitalist mode of production, when the conditions for an ex novo separation are posited. I will discuss this issue in more detail in Section 5, while assessing the elements of continuity of Marx's theory of primitive accumulation within the capitalist mode of production. Second, insisting on the role of separation in the definition of primitive accumulation and stressing that the distinction between accumulation and primitive accumulation is based on the conditions of implementation of the separation opens the way for investigating what are the different possible forms of primitive accumulation. This, of course, may lead to the formulation of a taxonomy of primitive accumulation that cannot be discussed here. In Section 4, I instead discuss some of the variants of primitive accumulation proposed by Marx. 4. Different forms of primitive accumulation in Marx. It is well known that Marx's discussion of the process of land enclosures in England was a mere illustration of primitive accumulation, an illustration specific to England. Furthermore, even Marx's discussion of primitive accumulation in England takes us by default to distant lands, to the extent these areas are linked and subordinated to the process of accumulation in England. A typical example is the slave trade. Between 1690 and 1721, new ports were created, as in Liverpool, while old ones gained new life as a result of flourishing slave trade, as in Bristol. The number of transported slaves jumped from 27,500 in the 17th century to an estimate of between 40,000 and 100,000 in the 18th century. Marx has no difficulty in pointing out that Liverpool grew fat on the basis of the slave trade, and that indeed, this was its method of primitive accumulation. However, this method of primitive accumulation did not entail a classic Marxist model of transition applied to Africa from feudalism to capitalism. This model, that was common Marxist orthodoxy until not long ago, by emphasizing the role played by land enclosures in the transition from feudal to a capitalist mode of production in England, has contributed to turn the concept of primitive accumulation into a cornerstone of a monumental building generally referred to as stage theory. Instead, the example of the slave trade shows that primitive accumulation may occur through the interaction between North and South, an international division of labor, the destruction of African communities, and enslavement. Marx was, of course, very well aware of all these forms. Therefore, in this case, the historical process of separating the producers from the means of production revealed characteristics and dimensions quite different from the stereotypical representation of land enclosure portraying the passage from feudalism to capitalism in Europe. Here, primitive accumulation is consistent with an understanding of the capitalist economy as a world economy, in a Braudelian sense, in which accumulation in one place may correspond to primitive accumulation in another, in which the ex novo production of the separation can be the condition of the reproduction of the same separation in another interlinked place. At this junction, we can fully appreciate the insights provided by the interpretation we labeled the continuous inherent primitive accumulation. Marx refers to other forms of primitive accumulation. These are the ones obtained through the manipulation of money at the state. Marx regards public debt, international credit system, and taxes as fundamental means of further primitive accumulation. Public debt, quote, becomes one of the most powerful levers of primitive accumulation. As with the stroke of an enchanter's wand, it endows unproductive money with the power of creation, and thus turns it into capital, without forcing it to expose itself to the troubles and risks inseparable from its employment in industry or even in usury. End quote. Complementary to public debt is a modern fiscal system, quote, whose pivot is formed by taxes on the most necessary means of subsistence, and therefore by increases in their prices, thus contains within itself the germ of automatic progression. Overtaxation is not an accidental occurrence, but rather a principle. In Holland, therefore, where this system was first inaugurated, the great patriot De Witt extolled it in his maxims as the best system for making the wage laborer submissive, frugal, industrious, and overburdened with work. All the same, the international credit system that grows along national debt often conceals one of the sources of primitive accumulation in this or that people. A great deal of capital, which appears today in the United States without any birth certificate, was yesterday in England the capitalized blood of children. End quote. All these examples point out the fact that primitive accumulation for Marx does not assume only the form of direct land enclosure as in the process of English primitive accumulation, but it also occurs through other means. A brief survey of the current literature on the link between third world debt and widespread poverty reveals that the features of 18th and 19th century capitalism may well have a striking resemblance to those of 21st century capitalism, once of course a different historical context are taken into consideration. 5. The continuous character of primitive accumulation. 5.1. Introduction. In a recent important study, Michael Perlman supports the idea of the continuous character of primitive accumulation in Marx along three main lines of interpretation, and provides some textual evidence. Also, Perlman points out that Marx wanted to de-emphasize the concept of primitive accumulation for a political and strategic rather than theoretical reason. Excessive emphasis on primitive accumulation would have distracted the reader from the silent compulsion of the market. The argument is that Marx wanted to stress the role of market forces, where market forces have replaced primitive accumulation as a disciplinary device enforcing the separation between labor and the means of production. Although this interpretation may explain Marx's relatively less extended discussion of the category of primitive accumulation, it does not address a question of the extent to which Marx's theoretical framework is compatible with the continuous character of primitive accumulation. 5.2. Continuity, Class Conflict, and Communism. The interpretation of Marx's analysis of primitive accumulation presented thus far has revealed two basic interconnected points. First, primitive accumulation is the ex novo production of the separation between producers and means of production, and therefore, in certain conditions, it represents a strategy. Second, this social process or strategy can take different forms. The historicity contained in the concept is revealed not so much by the fact that primitive accumulation occurs before the capitalist mode of production, although this is also the case, but it is a basis, the presupposition, the basic condition which is necessary if accumulation of capital must occur. It must be noted that this last definition is Marx's own, and is more general than the one adopted by the classical historical interpretation, and therefore it includes it. This is because if primitive accumulation is defined in terms of the preconditions it satisfies for the accumulation of capital, its temporal dimension includes in principle both the period of the establishment of a capitalist mode of production and the preservation and expansion of the capitalist mode of production any time the producers set themselves as an obstacle to the reproduction of their separation to the means of production. Separation understood in terms described before. Another way to put it would be through Karl Polanyi's concept of double movement. On one side there is the historical movement of the market, a movement that has not inherent limit and that therefore threatens society's very existence. On the other, there is society's natural propensity to defend itself, and therefore to create institutions for its protection. In Polanyi's terms, the continuous element of Marx's primitive accumulation could be identified in those social processes or sets of strategies aimed at dismantling those institutions that protect societies from the market. The crucial element of continuity in the reformulation of Marx's theory of primitive accumulation arises therefore once we acknowledge the other movement of society. We have derived the strategic character of primitive accumulation from its definition, the historical process of divorcing the producer from the means of production, while in the definition of accumulation, this divorcing occurred at increasing scale. In Marx, this latter divorcing is clearly the result of the driving force of what we may call a main historical subject, albeit a depersonalized one, that is, capital, which Marx repeatedly defines in terms of its endless drive for self-expansion, accumulation. This endless drive for expansion is bound to clash against such limits as those posed by geographical areas unaffected by capitalist production or at its margin. Examples of expansion in geographical areas include, for example, the already cited slave trade mentioned by Marx, and Luxemburg's discussion may at least be seen as highlighting this insight within Marx's text. However, Marx often refers to capital also as a reactive vis-a-vis those social forces that pose a limit to accumulation. Especially, capital was seen as reacting against the effects of various struggles engaged by what Marx believed was a historical subject of social transformation par excellence, the working class. The clash of these two historical forces reveals the oppositional nature of the present form of production relations, which gives signs of its becoming, foreshadowing of the future. We have seen that Marx defines the oppositional nature embedded in capitalist relations of production in terms of the separation between producers and means of production. Thus, the definition of primitive accumulation, of the origin of this separation, is linked to the heart of Marx's vision of human society, as it mirrors a vision of its opposite, that the producers have direct access to the means of production. It goes without saying that the latter refers to a condition of collective production, and not merely to an individual market strategy for survival, which is alternative to wage labor. For Marx, direct access to the means of production can certainly acquire many forms, some of which can historically coexist, also with forms of exploitation. However, they all show different degrees of the thing which is, with no doubt, so central in Marxist thinking: producers' autonomy and self-determination in the organization and administration of social labor. Thus, primitive accumulation, defined in terms of separation, which is treated in the last section of Volume 1 of Capital, is only a mirrored image of Marx's leap into a hypothetical post-capitalist society, suggested in the first section of the same volume, in which he imagines an association of free men working with the means of production held in common and expending their many different forms of labor power in full self-awareness as one single social labor force. In a previous section, I have indicated that the alienated character of labor results from the reproduction of the separation between producers and means of production within the accumulation process. The alienated character of labor is, of course, one of the main sources of inherent and continuous class conflict within Marxist theory of capitalism. Also, its transcendence is, for Marx, the main horizon along which he can envisage a post-capitalist society. Within Marx's theoretical and critical framework, therefore, the divorcing embedded in the definition of primitive accumulation can be understood not only as an origin of capital vis-a-vis pre-capitalist social relations, but also as a reassertion of capital's priorities vis-a-vis those social forces that run against the separation. Thus, pre-capitalist spaces of autonomy, the common land of the English yeoman, the commons of Africa targeted by slave merchants, are not the only objects of primitive accumulation strategies. Objects of primitive accumulation also become any given balance of power among classes that constitutes a rigidity for furthering the capitalist process of accumulation, or that runs in the opposite direction. Since for Marx, working class struggles are a continuous element of the capitalist relation of production, capital must continuously engage in strategies of primitive accumulation to recreate the basis of accumulation itself. This element of continuity of primitive accumulation is not only consistent with Marx's empirical analysis describing the process of primitive accumulation, but seems also to be contained in his theoretical framework. This is because accumulation is equal to primitive accumulation to a higher degree, and, once capital exists, the capitalist mode of production itself evolves in such a way that it maintains and reproduces this separation on a constantly increasing scale until the historical reversal takes place. Thus, the historical reversal is set as a limit to accumulation, and primitive accumulation is set as a challenge from capital's perspective to that historical reversal. To the extent class conflict creates bottlenecks to the accumulation process in the direction of reducing the distance between producers and means of production, any strategy used to recuperate or reverse this movement of association is entitled with categorization, consistently with Marx's theory of definitions of primitive accumulation. Marx's text is quite clear on this. As cited earlier, I reproduce here for convenience. Accumulation relies on, quote, the silent compulsion of economic relations, which sets the seal on the domination of the capitalist over the worker. In this case, direct extra economic force is still of course used, but only in exceptional cases. In the ordinary run of things, the worker can be left to the natural laws of production, i.e., it is possible to rely on his dependence on capital, which springs from the conditions of production themselves, and is guaranteed in perpetuity by them. Differently, during the historical genesis of capitalist production, the rising bourgeoisie needs the power of the state, and uses it to regulate wages, i.e., to force them into the limits suitable for making a profit, to lengthen the working day, and to keep the worker himself at his historical level of dependence. This is an essential aspect of so-called primitive accumulation. End quote from Marx. The key difference between the ordinary run of things and primitive accumulation, therefore, seems to be the existence of a working class which by education, tradition, and habit looks upon the requirements of that mode of production as self-evident natural laws. Therefore, insofar as the working class accepts capital's requirements as natural laws, Accumulation does not need primitive accumulation. However, working class struggles represent precisely a rupture in that acceptance, a nonconformity to the laws of supply and demand, a refusal of subordination to the ordinary run of things. When this happens, two interrelated phenomena follow in Marx's opinion. First, the ideological use of political economy to legitimize the ordinary run of things, or the natural laws of capitalist production. Quote, as soon as the workers learn the secret of why it happens that the more they work, the more alien wealth they produce, as soon as, by setting up trade unions, etc., they try to organize planned cooperation between the employed and the unemployed in order to obviate or to weaken the ruinous effects of this natural law of capitalist production on their class, so soon does capital and its sycophant political economy cry out at the infringement of the eternal and, so to speak, sacred law of supply and demand. End quote from Marx. To the extent we identify ideology as a form of social power, then this ideological use of political economy at this juncture is in itself an extra economic means to reimpose the ordinary run of things. Second, Marx of course emphasizes other, more material extra economic means. Quote, every combination between employed and unemployed disturbs the pure action of this law. But on the other hand, as soon as adverse circumstances prevent the creation of an industrial reserve army, and with it, the absolute dependence of the working class upon the capitalist class, capital, along with its platitudinous Sancho Panza, rebels against the sacred law of supply and demand and tries to make up for its inadequacies by forcible means. End quote from Marx. It follows therefore that not only is primitive accumulation the historical basis, instead of the historical result of specific capitalist production, but it also requires a continuous character, dependent on the inherent continuity of social conflict within capitalist production. In the next two sections, I provide two short illustrations of these elements of continuity extrapolated from Marx's text. 5.3. Illustration 1. The continuity of primitive accumulation and the enclosures. The first example does not entail a mature capitalist mode of production, but serves as a better way to point out the conceptual relevance of class struggle for the definition of primitive accumulation in Marx. I take this example from an event that took place during the classic period of English land enclosure. On Sunday, April 1st, 1649, a small group of poor men collected on St. George's Hill, just outside London and at the edge of the Windsor Great Forest, hunting ground of the king and the royalty. They started digging the land as a symbolic assumption of ownership of the common lands. Within 10 days, their number grew to 4,000 or 5,000. 1 year later, the colony had been forcefully dispersed, huts and furniture burnt, the diggers chased away from the area. This episode of English history could be consistently added to Marx's chapter 28, entitled Bloody Legislation Against the Expropriated. Yet, whilst most of that chapter deals with Tudor's legislation aimed at criminalizing and repressing popular behavior induced by the expropriation of land, vagrancy, begging, theft, this episode goes a step further by making clear that primitive accumulation acquires meaning vis-a-vis patterns of resistance and struggle. This episode entails the active and organized activity of a mass of urban and landless poor, aimed at the direct reappropriation of land for its transformation into common land. Paraphrasing Marx, it is an activity aimed at associating the producer with the means of production. It is clear, therefore, that force used by authorities to disperse the diggers can be understood, consistently with Marx's theory, as an act of primitive accumulation, because it reintroduces the separation between producers and means of production. Although Marx did not include this episode in his treatment of primitive accumulation, in chapter 28, he does refer to a handful of cases in which struggles are counterposed to state legislation, which either represents a retreat of capital vis-a-vis these struggles or an attempt to contain them. 5.4. Illustration 2. The continuity of primitive accumulation and the social barrier against capital. Another example involves a mature capitalist production and takes us to Marx's description of the relation between absolute and relative surplus value in the case of the limit to the working day. At the end of chapter 10 of Capital, on the working day, Marx points out how working class actions, are responsible for erecting a social barrier on the extension of the working day. Quote, "For protection against the serpent of their agonies, the workers have to put their heads together and, as a class, compel the passing of a law, an all-powerful social barrier by which they can be prevented from selling themselves and their families into slavery and death by voluntary contract with capital. In the place of the pompous catalogue of the inalienable rights of man, there steps the modest Magna Carta of the legally limited working day, which at least makes clear when the time which the worker sells is ended and when his own begins." End quote from Marx. This all-powerful social barrier brought about by workers' struggles, and which defines the extension of the working day, sets a limit to the extraction of absolute surplus value. The definition of a social barrier evokes the idea of a social limit beyond which capital cannot go in furthering the opposition of dead to living labor. In this sense, this social barrier is a form of social common, because it sets a limit to the extension, the scale of the separation between producers and means of production. It is by putting their heads together as a class and enforcing a limit to the working day that the producers assert their human needs vis-a-vis the alienating system of production, and close the gap that separates them from the means of production. At this point, capital introduces machinery, that is, the most powerful weapon for suppressing strikes, those periodic revolts of the working class against the autocracy of capital. The introduction of machinery at this junction represents an act of accumulation, of recreation of the separation at a greater scale beyond the limit posed by the social barrier. By rationalizing the working day, restructuring the work process, and dismissing the workforce, the introduction of machinery aims at bypassing that social barrier that was erected, and therefore recreate the separation between forces of production and producers at a greater scale. In so doing, it intensifies labor to the extent that the denser hour of the 10-hour working day contains more labor, i.e. expended labor power, than the more porous hour of the 12 working day. It goes without saying that any attempt to repeal the law that sets the extension of the working day would be instead an act of ex novo production of that separation, an act of primitive accumulation. Conclusion. The interpretive framework here provided stressed the continuity of primitive accumulation and its fundamental persistence in mature capitalist economics. The foundation of this continuity is found once we recognize what Marx calls the oppositional nature of the capitalist relation. The result is, I believe, a picture of Marx's theory of primitive accumulation, which gives us insights into the essential character of capitalist accumulation itself, the divorce between producers and means of production, and about the limits posed on capitalist accumulation by social struggles. Reformulating Marx's theory of primitive accumulation in this way helps to rescue Marx's theory of the capitalist mode of production from its political irrelevance at best and its instrumentality for capitalist oppression at worst. Indeed, to consider primitive accumulation as an historical phase rather than a recurrent strategy vis-a-vis the continuous character of struggles has opened the way even for revolutionaries to welcome it and promote it as a necessary stage towards socialism. The emphasis put here on the basic conceptual similarity between those processes that occurred in the period regarded by historians as the dawn of the capitalist era and the age regarded by simple common sense as a mature capitalist system did not mean to downplay the obvious remarkable differences. The modern form of primitive accumulation occurs in contexts quite different from the ones in which the English enclosure movement or the slave trade took place. Yet, to emphasize their common character allows us to interpret the new without forgetting the hard lessons of the old. Socioeconomic rights and entitlements are in most cases a result of past battles. State institutions had developed and attempted to accommodate many of these rights and entitlements with the priorities of a capitalist system. The entitlements and rights guaranteed by the post-war welfare state, for example, can be understood as the institutionalization of particular forms of social commons. Together with high growth policies, the implementation of full employment policies, and the institutionalization of productivity deals, the welfare state was set to accommodate people's expectations after 2 world wars, the Soviet Revolution, and a growing international union movement. Therefore, the current global neoliberal project, which in various ways targets the social commons created in the post-war period, set itself as a modern form of enclosure, dubbed by some as new enclosures. Thus, the understanding of the continuous character of enclosures points to 2 crucial political questions. First, the fact that there is a common ground between different phenomenal forms of neoliberal policies, and that peoples in the North, East, and South are facing possibly phenomenally different but substantially similar strategies of separation from the means of existence. Second, it allows us to identify the broadest central question that any discussion on alternatives within the growing global anti-capitalist movement must pose: the issue of the direct access to the means of existence, production, and communication, the issue of the commons.